who has a story of a survivor that is very near and dear to her heart.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you so much for having me here today, and thank you for your efforts on behalf of sexual assault survivors within the military community. My name is Adrian Perry, and I am here on behalf of my now 7-year-old daughter. Our life in the military began when I met my husband, Breck, in college. Shortly after we met, he enlisted in the Marine Corps Reserves in 2000, and upon graduation from college, he became an officer. Our first duty station was at Quantico, where Breck attended infantry officer school. Since then, we have moved 7 times to include Hawaii, Okinawa, Japan, and 3 different tours at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. We have been through many deployments together, 3 of which were combat tours to Afghanistan. Throughout our 16 years of marriage, I have proudly stood by my husband's side as a Marine spouse. Our 3 children have been raised in the Marine Corps way of life, and up until the sexual abuse that my daughter suffered, we have always enjoyed the adventures and experiences we've shared as a military family. Presently, my husband is a major in the United States Marine Corps, serving as the executive officer for 2-6 at Camp Lejeune. In 2013, my husband received orders to Japan, where we spent 3 years. During this time, he served under 3 different officers in charge, one of them being Colonel Wilson. Colonel Wilson was a full-bird colonel, meaning he was a very high-ranking officer who was 1 rank shy of becoming a general. Towards the end of our tour in Okinawa, Wilson was assigned a very prestigious job in Australia, where he was going to be represented the United States Marine Corps on a 6-month training exercise between the Australian Defense Force and the Marine Corps. Not even 2 weeks after Wilson took command, he was abruptly relieved of his position as the senior officer in charge of this exercise with the Australian Defense Force. My husband was not given the details as to why he was relieved. Shortly after Wilson was relieved of his position in Australia, he was quietly reassigned to a position of extreme increased responsibility and influence at Camp Lejeune Marine Corps Base in North Carolina as the 2nd Marine Expeditionary Force G3 Operations Officer. With this new highly respected position, his responsibilities continued to increase, and his position became even more prestigious. The Camp Lejeune Command was completely unaware that Wilson had been relieved from this position in Australia prior to his arrival to Lejeune. In May of 2016, our family was given orders to move from Okinawa, Japan to Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. Wilson reached out to my husband upon our arrival to Camp Lejeune since he was already settled into base housing. Wilson and his wife were very kind and gracious, inviting us over to their home on multiple occasions. A couple of weeks after we began spending time at the Wilsons' home, one of my daughters, whom was 6 years old at the time, disclosed to me that Wilson had sexually abused her. Her twin sister eventually shared something he did to her as well. Immediately, we notified the military police, and the military police alerted Naval Crime Scene Investigative Service, also known as NCIS. My husband and I gave NCIS as much information as we possibly could about Wilson. We told them about how Wilson was relieved from his position in Australia. We recommended they look into his removal and find out why. NCIS then siphoned all electronic data from our phones for evidence, which we did authorize. The 2nd MEF, the 2 MEF command, which was Wilson's command, authorized a military protective order stating Wilson could not be within 500 feet of our family. Other than the protective order, there were no additional restrictions placed upon Wilson. He was not confined to the military jail like we had hoped and asked. Instead, he was allowed to live freely on base, which was less than a mile away from our home. We felt the protective order was not being taken seriously. We made repeated attempts to meet with authorities regarding our concerns. We pleaded that the order be enforced in multiple meetings. I should not have to fight to have a protective order enforced properly for my children. As months passed by, our case just seemed to sit stagnant. Legal responsibilities were shifted around between several people, causing us to have inconsistencies on who was working our case. I could not understand how this case was going to go to trial with any hope of seeing justice served for our family, considering no one was speaking to my husband or myself. We were assigned a victim's legal counsel who was a knowledgeable lawyer and a good-hearted Marine officer, but lacked the experience. And quite frankly, he was fighting outside his weight class on this case. My husband and I kept making phone calls and explaining our discontent with the lack of communication. It was not until our godson, Lieutenant Colonel John Stevens, was assigned to our case in November, 4 months after we reported what Wilson had done, that we were actually able to start piecing the puzzle together. I took it upon myself to seek out civilian victims legal counsel through Arnold and Porter, Kay Scholler, whom works with Protect Our Defenders. Lieutenant Colonel Stevens, his trial team, a new military VLC that was assigned to our case, and our civilian VLCs were welcomed assets to us. Less than 6 months after Wilson sexually abused my daughter on multiple occasions, he sexually assaulted an adult female. She courageously came forward and reported what he had done to her. It was only after she came forward that the command finally decided Wilson needed to be sent to the military jail while he awaited trial for all charges against him. We thought NCIS would surely seize his devices after one more horrible allegation. However, we were wrong. To this day, Wilson's cell phone and computer, his personal devices, were never ever seized. Our case went to trial in August. It was then that the reasons for his removal from Australia finally came to surface, over a year after he was relieved. Wilson was relieved from his position in Australia because of serious misconduct, some of which was sexual in nature. Wilson's misconduct was never addressed. Instead, he was given a dream job at Camp Lejeune. The details of his behavior described at the trial warranted serious consequences that would never have allowed him to have the job he was given at Camp Lejeune. If you hear anything I have to say at all today, please let it be this. If the United States Marine Corps, Okinawa Command, had properly punished Wilson over a year and a half ago for his misconduct in Australia, he would never have been able to harm my daughters. Their failure to punish him cost one of my daughters her innocence. And to me, that's unforgivable. The system as we know it today is slanted. It is a system where it's set up to retrieve evidence from the victim with little motivation to obtain any evidence from the accused. For example, Wilson's personal electronic devices. Another huge concern is command bias. In the military, if you are accused of a crime, the commander has the authority to decide whether or not the crime and evidence presented is worthy of going to trial. These commanders are being given legal authority when they have zero education regarding legal matters. These are a few of the reasons why so many of these cases never see a courtroom. We are fortunate in that our case did go to trial. I desperately fought our way to justice being somewhat served for our family. Had I not been such a loud and persistent voice for my daughters, this case would never have made it to a general court-martial. No parent should ever have to fight the way my husband and I had to fight in order to get our case to trial. As I sat in the courtroom on sentencing day, I could not believe what I was witnessing. The judge looked at the jury, who consisted of generals and colonels. Not one of them was a female. And he told them to take into account Wilson's prior military service to our country when they go to sentence him. The judge then read off a very long, glorifying, and detailed bio of every single leadership position Wilson held, every medal he ever received, and every combat deployment he was ever a part of. If a person worked for Apple for 30 plus years and was convicted of sexual assault, would the judge in civilian courts look the jury in the eye and tell them to take into account all the great things this individual did for Apple when they go to sentence him? No. Although I am angry about the amount of time Wilson was given, I realize, after speaking with several survivors, that the majority of survivors get no justice whatsoever. This should not be the case, and it's shameful to say the least. I also cannot help but to think about how different our case could have turned out if my husband had been a young enlisted Marine rather than a major. I believe with all my heart, if my husband were a young enlisted Marine, this case would have never, ever made it to a general court-martial. Currently, I am trying to be a voice and shine a light on how these cases are handled in the military. I am hopeful that my being here today and sharing our story will help everyone understand that change within the current military justice system must be made in order to properly serve survivors of sexual assault within the military. Approving the Military Justice Improvement Act is the first vital step necessary in order to afford sexual assault survivors the opportunity to see justice served for the abuse they have endured. I stand before you today and ask that you please consider supporting this act. How many more survivors have to be denied justice due to a seriously flawed system before change will be made? I hope the stories you hear today are the last ones you need to hear in order to support Senator Gillibrand's Military Justice Improvement Act. If the Military Justice Improvement Act had already been a law, I would not be standing here in front of you today, and I believe that my daughter could have been spared her innocence. Thank you so much.
Our first speaker is Senator Kennedy.
Thank you, Senator. A really, really smart person, I don't remember who it was, once said that you can debate the age of the human race, but we can all agree that it's old enough to know better. Unfortunately, some people know better, but they do immoral things anyway. Now, I'm a good Methodist. I try to be anyway. And I believe in free will. But with that free will goes responsibility. And I am proud today to support this pro-fairness, pro-justice, pro-military bill. This will make our military stronger, not weaker. The simple fact of the matter is that it is wrong for any person to use his or her power to force or to try to achieve sexual gratification from another person who doesn't consent. And that's just wrong. And we are seeing it and have seen it, and in the last 6 months have seen it way too often. And I want to thank everybody for speaking up. We saw it first in the entertainment industry. As an aside, I don't know how they have time to make movies in Hollywood. And this is breathtaking. But it's not limited to the entertainment world. We know it exists in business. And we know it exists in government. And we know it exists in military. Now, the vast majority of men and women who serve this country bravely and honorably do not participate in this sort of misbehavior. But some do. And they've got to be called out. And this bill does that. And it will make our military and our country stronger for it, in my judgment. And I want to thank the Senator for including me in this today.
We all know that our military has a sexual assault problem. Every Secretary of Defense for more than 2 decades has acknowledged this. All of them, starting with Dick Cheney in the early 1990s and all the way through Secretary Mattis earlier this year, have explicitly pledged a zero tolerance for sexual assault within their ranks. Yet the military continues to fail at solving this very simple problem. Instead, we continue to have no accountability. And meanwhile, Congress is AWOL on its oversight responsibilities. Even 4 years after the problem of sexual assault in the military was forced out of the shadows by survivors, and after renewed pledges by the military brass of "we got this," the system remains broken. The problem hasn't gone away, and military sexual assault is as pervasive as ever. Listen to just the headlines of the last few months. From March, quote, "Reports of sexual assault increase at 2 military academies." From September, quote, "Bad Santa. Navy's top admiral kept spokesman after boozy party sexual predator warning." From October, in the military, trusted officers have become alleged assailants in sex crimes. From just a few weeks ago, quote, "Senior military officials sanctioned for more than 500 cases of serious misconduct." Enough is enough. The number that keep coming out of the Pentagon, the stories and patterns that we see when analyzing sexual assault case files in the military, the scandals where senior members of the military are preying on people who are supposed to be able to trust them, it all continues. All of this should shock and appall every single member of Congress. We're seeing a high number of civilian victims as well as military victims, a low prosecution rate of sexual assault cases, and no improvement in the rate of retaliation against those who are brave enough to come forward. This shows that there is still not good order and discipline in our military, and it shows that our system is broken because it protects predators. It fails to protect victims. And most of all, it shows that commanders still aren't able to police themselves and hold predators accountable, despite all their claims to the contrary. I urge my colleagues in the Senate to support this bipartisan bill, the Military Justice Improvement Act, which already has the support of senators from across the aisle, including the one standing here with me. How much longer do service members have to wait before we finally do the right thing? How many more years after putting the military on a clock to solve this problem will Congress no longer accept the status quo? How much longer do men and women who so bravely fight for our country have to wait for a military justice system that is worthy of their sacrifice? According to the recent survey by the Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of Americans, only 19% of women and 33% of men think that the Defense Department is effectively handling sexual assault. 71% of women and 64% of men who reported sexual assault suffered retaliation after reporting. And 46% of women said it was more likely they would report if prosecutors, not commanders, got to make the decision about whether or not to move forward. This is what the numbers say. We need to take the prosecution of military sexual assault and other violent felonies out of the chain of command now, put it in the hands of independent military prosecutors who know what they're doing, who are trained to prosecute these crimes. Military officers don't have the legal training that they need to make such difficult decisions that in the civilian world would be handled by district attorneys with years of experience. Our commanders have a tough enough job already. We should let trained, experienced prosecutors take this burden off their hands. But the only way we can make this change is if we pass our bill. There should be no more excuses. Listen to the stories. Listen to Adrian Perry. That story of her daughters is heartbreaking. Listen to what her family experienced after reporting that her children were sexually assaulted by a high-ranking military officer who should have never been in that position in the first place. Listen to what really is likely to happen in the military and why justice is not possible. This system is broken, and if Congress doesn't fix it, then it means that Congress is part of the problem. So I urge everyone here with me and who is listening, please speak out about this. Raise your voice, tell your story. Let's do everything we can to pass this bill. We need access to a justice system that is independent, well-trained, professional, and fair. I'd now like to introduce our next speaker, which is Senator Blumenthal.
I really want to begin by thanking particularly the survivors who are here today and who have stepped forward to tell their stories so that they can save others these kinds of tragedies, and the advocates who have devoted their lives to trying to seek justice for others within a system that desperately needs improvement, and most particularly to our colleague, Senator Gillibrand, who has been tireless and passionate on this issue and on others where justice needs to be improved. As on our college campuses. She has been passionate, but extraordinarily insightful. And that is what this measure is as well. It is a step toward addressing a profoundly emotional and destructive act, wherever it happens, in the military or in civilian life. But it accomplishes its goal in an insightful and thoughtful and wise way. And therefore, it's good for the military, as well as for the victims and survivors of this heinous crime. Sexual assault, sexual groping, sexual violence, sexual harassment are never okay. They are never okay, no matter where they occur. Whether in the military, or the boardroom, or any other forum. And taking this decision out of the hands of the military professionals and putting it in the hands of prosecutorial professionals is a great service to them. These judgments about whether to prosecute and how to do it are extraordinarily challenging. As a federal prosecutor and a former attorney general, I know well the kinds of judgments that have to be made. They involve assessing the strength of evidence and witnesses, and they are particularly demanding in the military. And that's why professional prosecutors should be making this decision, and why I'm very proud to stand with Senator Gillibrand, the other advocates here, the survivors and victims, to say to our United States military, you deserve the utmost respect and admiration for what you do in combat, in service, in sacrifice. And that's why we want to do you the respect of having trained professionals make prosecutorial decisions out of respect for your extraordinary skill and training and ability on the battlefield and in service to our nation. We want to rid the military of any possible problem that we can avoid when it comes to combating sexual assault. And we know the military is committed to ending sexual assault. It's just a question of how best we get there, and this represents the best way to do it. Thank you to Senator Gillibrand for your persistence and your passion.
Senator Macy-Corona.
Hello, everyone. I'm glad to stand here with Senator Gillibrand, who has been a leader in addressing the issue of sexual assault and sexual trauma in the military, and standing with my colleagues here, as well as so many others who have signed on to Senator Gillibrand's bill. The chain of command in the military is pretty much deemed sacrosanct. And because of that, we have basically in the military institutionalized a process that protects the assaulters. Because you have to go often to the very people, sometimes the perpetrators of these assaults themselves, or definitely a chain of command not sympathetic to disrupting the lives of people who have served in the military for a long time as a generation. So we have institutionalized and protected a process that does not result in justice for the victims. And if this were the case in the civilian context, do you think any of us would consider that fair? Do you think any of us would stand for it? And yet, on the military side, this has been going on for years and years and years. And this is why, in spite of the fact that certain improvements were made to the Code of Military Justice, that we stand here today with even more recent stories that show us that the changes that we saw 4 years ago have not occurred, and certainly not to the degree that we would want them to occur. So once again, we hear these heartbreaking stories. We hear of sentencing where I would say the experience of a soldier or someone who has otherwise good record is dragged in as a way to ameliorate the horror of the crimes committed. So it is about time that we take these decisions out of the hands of people who are in an inherent conflict and moving these cases forward and putting them in the hands of professional JAG officers. So I stand here with you, all of you.
Senator Martin Heinrich.
Thank you, Senator Gillibrand. I am here because the status quo is not working. It is not serving the members of our armed forces, it is not serving the victims, it is not serving their families. But we can do something about it. We can make these changes. I've been on the Armed Services Committee for 4 years in the House of Representatives and now 5 years in the Senate. And I have been there too many times when I have heard, we're gonna do better, we have zero tolerance, we're gonna do something about this, we're committed to it. The numbers just don't show that. The stories don't show that. So it's up to all of us to do something about it. And that's why we're here today. This legislation that Senator Gillibrand has been so doggedly pursuing since I came to the Senate, it is long past overdue, and it will make our armed services, as Senator Kennedy said, stronger, much stronger. This is a cancer on our armed services, but it doesn't have to be. We can make change. That's why we're here.
Our next speaker is Senator Don Christensen. Excuse me, Senator, I just promoted you. Don, wait, run for office. Don Christensen, our former.
Is that a promotion?
Yeah, exactly. I don't know, probably not. It's a demotion. Don Christensen, former Chief Prosecutor of the United States Air Force and President of Protect Our Defenders. Colonel, retired.
Thank you, Senator Gillibrand. Protect Our Defenders is an organization devoted solely to helping survivors of sexual assault and bring change. And we stand so proudly with Senator Gillibrand and the other senators who are here today in support of the Military Justice Improvement Act. There's basically two things I want to say very quickly. The military is failing. You've heard that over and over, and Adrian's proof of that. Last year, there were 4,600 unrestricted reports of sexual assault in the military. 4,600 women and men came forward and said, I have been sexually assaulted or raped. Those 4,600 sexual assaults resulted in 389 courts martial, less than 10%. That resulted in 124 convictions of a sex offense. 98% of the reports did not result in a conviction. That means 98% of those people are still in the military, still serving, still out there as a threat to our military's ability to function. The second thing I want to talk about is something that Adrian said. The person that was a knight in shining armor to her was a prosecutor. I'm damn proud to be a prosecutor, or was when I was a prosecutor. Every day I fought hard for victims. A commander's job is not to fight hard for victims in the courtroom. Empower the prosecutors, empower Adrian's hero to be making these decisions, and you will get justice, and you will get results that make sure that there are not more Adrians out there. And very importantly, I want to say both of her children were victims. I don't care what the verdict was. Colonel Wilson assaulted both of her children, and we have to stop this. And thank you, Senator Gillibrand.
Our next speaker is Tom Porter, the Legislative Director of the Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America.
Thank you, Senator, for having us here and talking about this important issue. And thank you, Adrian, for having the courage to tell your story. I have small daughters myself, and I can't imagine that happened to them. And I hate to imagine how I'd react in a situation like that. So thank you. Thank you. It's unacceptable that not enough is being done to protect survivors of military sexual assault or to prevent these egregious crimes from happening in the first place. Time after time, we see the chain of command failing service members, and it's appalling that it remains a problem. Our members know this all too well, and I appreciate you citing our member survey. We recently surveyed more than 4,000 of our military members and veteran members at Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America. And the numbers are telling. As the Senator said, only 19% of IAVA women members and 33% of men said they think DoD is effectively addressing military sexual assault. Additionally, 35% of IAVA women members and 1% of male members are survivors of military sexual assault. And a particular note, 46% of female and 35% of male survivors said they would have been more likely to report their assault had a trained military prosecutor made the decision to move forward with the case. This problem appears to be carrying over from the DoD to the VA, where we know that 1 in 4 women receiving care have experienced military sexual assault, demonstrating a need to ensure their environment is welcoming to these women vets and that they have high quality care. This is one of the main reasons IAVA launched our She Who Borne the Battle campaign and its centerpiece, the Deborah Sampson Act, to help women vets. The bottom line is that with our reliance on an all-volunteer force that comes from less than 1% of America, we have to ensure that men and women know that their commanders will have their backs. Also, there are troubling numbers from the recent Blue Star Families survey where only 40% of respondents would recommend service to their child, a number that has continued to go down over the past 3 years, unfortunately. When my 3 daughters are making their career choices, I'd like to be able to recommend the military. But that depends on how this problem gets addressed. The time to act on the Military Justice Improvement Act is now. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Lori Manning, Captain, U.S. Navy, retired, fellow Service Women's Action Network.
Good morning. We at SWAN are so pleased to participate in Senator Gillibrand's press conference today. From the beginning, SWAN has been and continues to be a dedicated advocate of the Military Justice Integration Act. As perpetrators from Hollywood, Congress, and across multiple industries begin to face the consequences of their crimes, SWAN believes that our military women and men who have been preyed upon also deserve a #MeToo reckoning moment. This means not only bringing the perpetrators of military sexual violence to justice, but also a holding to account of those commanders who have compounded the crime by refusing to hold these predators accountable, as is their duty, and who have also failed to protect those who have reported sexual abuse from retaliation or indeed participating themselves in that retaliation. The military services have been promising Congress for years now to hold commanders accountable for their responsibilities under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. However, too many commanders continue to mishandle or dismiss accusations of sexual assault, and too many commanders allow or engage in retaliation against those who report sexual violence. Since its founding in 2007, SWAN has been working to educate the American public about sexual assault in the military. Our decade of work has led to significant improvements in victim services and to the military justice system. On Tuesday, SWAN wrapped up our annual summit of service women and women veterans who came to DC from across the country. The women brought with them their stories, reflected in SWAN's comprehensive annual survey of service women, that sexual violence continues to be the top issue affecting service women's mental wellness. This military sexual violence undermines unit readiness and cohesion, effectiveness, and military professionalism. In other words, it weakens our national security. That's why SWAN so strongly supports the Military Justice Improvement Act. I had the great privilege of serving as a military commander of over 350 sailors on the island of Diego Garcia in the British Indian Ocean Territory. So I know firsthand the multiple and sometimes contradictory pressures commanders face under extraordinarily demanding conditions. I also know how cursory the training commanders receive in the military justice system can be. I do not believe my command authority, my ability to lead my sailors, or to accomplish my mission would have been undermined by the provisions of the Military Justice Improvement Act. Indeed, I believe they would have been enhanced. So thank you, Senator Gillibrand.
Thank you.
May it pass this time.
Our last speaker is Dr. Tom Berger, Executive Director of the Veterans Health Council for the Vietnam Veterans of America.
Thank you, Senator, and thank you for stepping forward to tell your story. It's very important. The fact of the matter is that we at Vietnam Veterans of America have grown extremely tired of hearing from the DOD that it has zero tolerance, as you've already heard today, toward military sexual trauma. Military sexual trauma is slowly eroding the unity of the force, its mission capability, and our service members' trust in each other, and the honor of all those who have served our nation honorably. Just last month, we learned of a case of an alleged sexual harassment and assault by an Air Force senior officer at Maxwell Gunter Air Force Base in Alabama that was exactly the type of misconduct Pentagon leaders had promised Congress and us, the American public, that they would no longer tolerate. Air Force investigators quickly confirmed much of the civilian victim's account, aided by hundreds of electronic messages that the officer had texted to the woman. Under military law, the charges would have automatically resulted in a courts-martial, a proceeding as open to the public. The crime carried a sentence of up to 7 years in prison and a requirement for the senior officer to register as a sex offender. However, the decision on what to do next rested with a 3-star general 600 miles away at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, who subsequently decided against charging the perpetrator with abusive sexual contact or any crime at all. Instead, the 3-star imposed what the military calls non-judicial punishment or discipline for minor offenses. There would be no trial, no publicity, and no public record. The same for thousands of other sexual assault investigations each year in the armed forces. That's why Vietnam Veterans of America stands in solidarity in support of Senator Gillibrand's reintroduction of the MJIA.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Any on-topic questions for any of us?
Senator, has there been any indication of support for that? What's the position of the committee leadership, or any chance of getting this into another bill or onto the floor?
Well, what it's going to take is all of us speaking out. We hope to have an up or down vote on this issue directly, because we were not given a vote in the last MJIA. And it's been 2 years in a row that victims have been denied that vote, and so we are now calling for an up or down vote on this issue alone.
Gillibrand, do you have a response to the sexual assault allegations against Senator Franken that broke this morning?
We can answer those when these folks aren't standing here.
In regard to that, though, do you
Can we
think it's
just do
important to
MJIA
address
first,
that?
and then we
given
can,
the-
We'll
do
do
all
off
off topic separately, so the survivors and others don't have to stand here for it. Any others?
Are you confident that the bill will pass?
When we get a vote on it, I believe it will pass. And the reason why is because we are now seeing what an awful scourge this is across society. And the military, as you heard from Colonel Christensen's statistics, 2% of cases end in conviction. 2%. There isn't a mission among all their missions that are failing worse than this mission. They are failing miserably.
We have time for a couple off topics.
Okay, let's let everyone else speak. Excuse them.
Thank you so much for everything.
Thank you.
Oh, God bless you. We need to take a few meetings with the public health.
Okay, count on us.
Asking for the meeting to start now. Thank you, God bless you. Hey, how are you? Thank you. I'll be right back. Yep. You want to do it? Yep.